Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues, dear friends. Welcome to the panel Technologies and Effective Sanction Mechanisms. We will be more focused on legal questions today, and we have a very impressive guests. Let me introduce them first. First, we'll talk Aleksi Kajander, who is early stage researcher and PhD candidate of Law Department of Tallinn University of Technology. I can also tell you a secret. He is my former student. So having more than 27 years of teaching experience, I can say that he was one of the best, definitely. He was also co-author of some articles with me. Our second guest is Malone, who is associate professor of Law Department of Thompson Rivers University. So our third esteemed speaker is Alessandro Boggio Tomasaz, who is the legal advisor of the Council of the European Union. Also, he represented Council in different European Union courts. And last but not least, the most charming representative of our panel, Ewelina Grabinska, who is representative of the Analytical Department of General Directorate of Guardia di Finanza Italiana. I really sure you will enjoy our today's panel. My name is Evhen Tsybulenko. I am representative of Tallinn University of Technology Law Department as well. Actually, as our conference dedicated to the technological issues, before the conference I decided to chat a bit with artificial intelligence and pose to the GPT chart two simple questions. First, how Russia could be defeated in Russia-Ukrainian war, and one answer was exactly as I feel. It was very simple. It can be defeated by a combination of military power and sanctions. Sanctions is exactly what we will talk about today. And second question was how Ukrainian victory over Russia should look like. Artificial intelligence answered that Ukraine should regain the territorial control over the territory, including Crimea, of course, and reestablish the full sovereignty over the entire country. So, as you can see, probably it's even more clever than some populist politicians. Nothing about saving faces of the war criminals, Mr. Putin, red lines whatsoever. And even if today we will not concentrate on military side of our victory, sanctions will be definitely discussed in detail. Many people mistakenly believe that Russian war in Ukraine is a kind of Putin's war. We can hear it very often, but unfortunately it's not true. It's myth. It's war of Russia, of Russian people. It's clearly derived from all sociological polls, from the history. I will not even touch Soviet Union and Russian Empire. If simply to look on the new Russia after 1991, first years, then it was Yeltsin in power. Then everybody believed that Russia will be democratic. Russia was involved in first Chechen war. It was involved in first Georgian war. It was involved in a war in Moldova, creating this Muppet Transnistrian Moldovan Republic. All possible war crimes were committed already then. If we talk about Chechnya, for example, Samashki or Nova LD, maybe specialists know that names, but not general public at all, even if we will take Nova LD, for example, massacre, which was organized by Russian police in Chechnya, it was exactly the same like famous My Lai massacre of Americans in Vietnam, but in America it was national disgrace. Captain Kelly got life imprisonment after that. In Russia, nobody was punished, even if this case was addressed twice by European Court on Human Rights. Still, no any reaction, nobody was punished. So it simply shows that Russia is absolutely ignorant to not only to law of war, but to all basic rules and principles of international law. And it's happened actually before Putin. And with Putin, everything continued. In 2008, we were the witnesses of the brutal invasion of Russia to Georgia. Then in 2008, I wrote a dozen of articles addressed different media saying that next will be Ukraine and it will be started from Crimea. Nobody cared. France even started to build two Mistral assault helicopter carriers for Russia. And Russian Minister of Defense very happily said that if we would have such ships during Georgia war, we can solve the issue in 2 days. Problem is that impunity for Russia, it's invitation for further steps. And because Russia was never punished properly, we have occupation of Crimea in 2014, so Russo-Ukrainian war started not in 2022, but in 2014 actually. Eastern Ukraine was invaded, but sanctions were very weak, not adequate at all. In all modernized Russian tanks, airplanes, we can see French, German parts, most technological ones. Only now, then Russia launched full-scale invasion, we can see more or less powerful sanctions, but they still not fully adequate. There are a lot of possibilities to avoid them, and I hope that our panel will address all those questions. What are the shortcomings of the sanctions? How this question could be solved? So that probably is from my part. I will not take time from our esteemed guests. The format will be the following. Each speaker will have approximately 15 minutes. And after that, we will have a free microphone for discussion in the room, so everybody will have a possibility to pose questions. So thank you very much. And the first speaker will be Aleksi Kajander. The floor is all yours.
Thank you, and thank you for that kind introduction, Professor Tsybulenko. So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy and thankful to be here. And today, I'm going to talk to you about small commercial drones, their usage in Russia's illegal war of aggression in 2022, and what legal implications that has from the perspective of the dual-use regulation, for example. So, with that introduction out of the way, let's begin. So when the war began last year, the Bayraktar TB2 and similar drones, they came into the spotlight, and they kind of became a symbol for the Ukrainian resistance. And, you know, they are impressive-looking devices. They have missiles, and you can paint scary things on them. But I'm not here to talk about them today. I'm here to talk about these things here on the right, which are small, almost toy-like drones that nevertheless have a significant impact and have a considerable role to play on the modern battlefield. And what are the implications of that on, for example, the way we see dual-use goods under the EU's dual-use regulation, and also a couple of curious domestic law provisions that came up in this. But before we get there, I'd just like to explain a bit about what caught my attention and how I began this research. And it begins with a premise that kind of sounds like the beginning of a joke. It involves 3 drones, 1 man, and a border crossing. But there is no punchline. The guy just got arrested. But this case, and it happened almost a year ago in Estonia, a man with 3 drones, DJI Mini 2s to be specific, he was arrested at the Estonian border crossing. And he was trying to deliver those drones to help the Russian military in Ukraine. What caught my attention here was that those drones, they were specifically requested by the Russian 76th Airborne Assault Division, which I thought was quite curious, because these are very, very small drones. They're under 250 grams. You can carry one in your pocket. So why would this unit want that? Because there are larger drones, where you can modify them to drop grenades, for example. And of course, you know, there's just fundraising for very much larger drones. So why these drones? So that caught my attention. Now, the case itself, it wasn't terrifically difficult from a prosecutional point of view, because the man broadcasted on his social media that I am raising funds for the Russians in Ukraine, and I'm going to buy drones and I'm going to deliver to them. So his intent was quite clear. However, the other thing that caught my attention was actually under what he was prosecuted for. So Estonia had introduced on the 8th of May, 2022, a curious addition to its penal code, Article 91.1, which criminalized the knowingly supporting of a foreign act of aggression. And I thought that was interesting, again, for two reasons. The provision itself, and also what wasn't mentioned in that case. For example, dual-use goods, because surely, if those drones are being specifically requested by units fighting in Ukraine, then they must have a utility on the battlefield. And even though they're intended for civilians, they very clearly, based on that, should fit the definition of dual-use goods. But the reality there is a bit more complicated. So my presentation is broadly divided into three parts. The first part will cover the role of these drones that they've been playing in Ukraine in 2022. The second part will pertain to the EU's dual-use regulation. And the third part will discuss that curious addition to Estonia's penal code in just a bit more detail. So, in the Ukraine conflict, we've noticed that both sides, they've made really extensive use of commercial drones, small or otherwise. Now, when I was writing, it was estimated that Ukraine had about 6,000 commercial drones that it was using. But I did some research not too long ago, and according to the most recent reports, Ukraine is losing 10,000 drones a month now. So you can see that they are being used, but also that that use comes at a heavy cost. But nevertheless, they are quite prominent on the battlefield based on those figures alone. Now, why is this? Well, the drone, fundamentally these small, under 250-gram drones, they are basically a camera that flies. What you can do with that is reconnaissance the area, you can identify enemy positions, and you can even correct indirect fire based on that. Therefore, they have considerable utility for frontline troops because they enable to do this with considerably less risk and possibly much better efficiency than otherwise they could. And this, in turn, improves the situational awareness, which was identified in the Royal United Service Institute's preliminary report on the Ukraine war as being crucial to the survival of units, or to flip the sentiment, to their destruction. And therefore, these seemingly minute things, they have a really large impact on the efficiency of the frontline operations. And because they're so small, they're easy to distribute on a wider scale, because quite literally you can just carry one in your pocket, and you don't really have to be a rocket surgeon to operate one. And also, they are quite cheap and quite attributable in that sense, which is important because, as we're going to find out about the disadvantages, a lot of them will be lost. But the key point here is that a small commercial drone, it costs anywhere between $300 to $500. You can buy a lot of them if you compare them to military drones, or to make a complete loop, if you want to compare to the Bayraktar TB2 that costs about $5 million, you can buy about 10,000 to 12,000 small drones for that money. So that in itself is a point in favor of these small commercial drones. But obviously, they're not designed for military use. And as such, they have really quite severe limitations. Firstly, they're vulnerable to electronic warfare. They are vulnerable to jamming because obviously they were designed for civilians. They're not intended for warfare. They're not intended to stand up to jamming attempts and such. And as we figured out from the preliminary reports, in the first phases of the war, when the war was more mobile, drones were relatively more effective because, for example, the Russian electronic warfare had trouble keeping up, and therefore the coverage was rather spotty at best. Whereas now that the conflict has become more static, the electronic warfare's effectiveness has increased. But nevertheless, even in the early parts of the war, the first 3 months, 90% of Ukrainian drones were lost. And as we saw from the more recent casualty figures of approximately 10,000 a month, that is continuing. And therefore, to have that sort of sustained impact on the battlefield, they must be very replaceable and, by extension, cheaper. But these small commercial drones, they have some systems that are really not suited for military use. And one example of that is the recently discontinued aeroscope system. It was designed essentially to provide law enforcement with a means of tracking the drone's location, but also in the military sense, a very large disadvantage was incorporated in the other part of that function in the aeroscope, which is that it tracks the exact position of the operator, which obviously is very undesirable on a battlefield. And it's unencrypted. So that was also a rather large disadvantage. And anybody could buy those aeroscope systems. It looks like a kind of a small laptop, And as you can imagine, Russia actually did buy quite a few of them, because most of these drones that are used, they're manufactured in China, so it's the same manufacturer, even though the manufacturer itself doesn't sanction that sort of use. But nevertheless, they come from the same manufacturer, and on occasion it's difficult for the troops to actually distinguish whose drone it is. And therefore, through systems like that, they can really compromise the military usage of such small commercial drones. However, despite those limitations, it would appear that both combatants have used and will continue to use these commercial drones, at least until a military equivalent is available, as Ukraine has stated that they're trying to create similar drones, which have less of these disadvantages. But nevertheless, for the moment, they are quite cheap. They provide good situational awareness, and as such, they have a considerable role on the modern battlefield. Now, if we look at the EU's dual-use regulation, 821/2021, we get to the following definition of what is a dual-use drone. Now, I should be clear here that this definition that I'm about to go into, it's derived from the Wassenaar Arrangement, so therefore it doesn't apply just to the EU countries, but anybody who defines their dual-use goods in accordance with the Wassenaar Arrangement. So, when is the drone then dual-use? Well, the answer is in Annex 1. There are two options. The first one is quite straightforward. It has an endurance of longer than 60 minutes, so it can fly longer than an hour. Or, the second possibility is two cumulative conditions. Firstly, it has an endurance between 30 and 60 minutes, and it has a maximum takeoff wind resistance of 25 knots. Now, to bring back the Estonian man's case with the DJI Mini 2s, they are drones that they have an endurance of exactly 31 minutes, so they seemingly classify for 2A. However, their maximum takeoff wind resistance is actually only 20 knots, so they don't qualify, and therefore they're not dual-use drones. And that is where the problem lies. As I've just mentioned, they have a considerable role to play on the modern battlefield, and they do that primarily through their optics, which is what provides the situational awareness. But these definitions don't make any mention of that. Of course, it's annoying if your drone can't take off in the wind, but it's far more important what it's able to convey back to the troops in terms of the situational awareness. And therefore, this seems quite out of touch with the reality. Also, if we think about small commercial drones in particular, because they're very small, because they're cheap, because they're distributable, they're often used quite close to the front line, so the endurance limitation doesn't really matter as much. Not to mention that in the early part of the war, the average life expectancy of a drone is about 3 flights, which could be worse. Now we don't have the updated figures on that, but based on the 10,000 drones that are lost every month, it's probably not even that much. So a lot of those trips, they're going to be one way. And therefore, this definition seems to be a touch out of touch. Now, to wrap up my presentation, I come back to the domestic law that Estonia introduced for acts of aggression. So, this newly introduced Article 91.1, it focused on knowingly supporting foreign acts of aggression. And I should be clear here, this refers to more tangible acts. So it's not, say, thoughts or expressing support in words, it's doing that in a more material way, such as through financing or through donating drones or something similar. Now, why this is so significant is because of its threshold. There are, of course, comparable provisions in many domestic laws around Europe, but those have a slightly different threshold. The Estonian law does not require the individual to wield any state power. So it can be anybody, any Joe off the street that can technically be prosecuted under this, provided he does those acts. And that is what sets it apart from many of the other comparable laws around Europe, because they, generally speaking, require that the individual wields state power, which in turn limits the pool of individuals who fall under that considerably. There are also other laws that could have a similar function, such as treason laws, but they again are subject to certain limitations, which is often related to the citizenship requirements, and that the acts be against the country that you're in. So, for example, if we go back to the Estonian man on the border, he's not supporting a war against Estonia, he is supporting a war against Ukraine, and therefore prosecution under such type laws would obviously be a bit more difficult. Now, naturally, under the Estonian law, what is and isn't foreign act of aggression could become an issue potentially in the future, although in the current case where Russia is running a clearly illegal war of aggression, there's no doubt that it qualifies under this, but hopefully that will be the exception rather than the rule going forwards. And with that, I'd just like to wrap up my presentation. So I hope what you take away from here is that small commercial drones, despite the fact that they are very unimposing, very small, they're essentially a floating camera, they have a significant role to play on the modern battlefield. And this usage should be reflected in the dual-use regulations and definitions in order to be in accordance with that reality. And then finally, domestic law provisions, such as exemplified by Estonia's Article 91.1, they represent an alternative for curtailing grassroots-level support on, well, a variety of acts, really, that are intended to support for example, Russia conducting its war in Ukraine, and they are invaluable in the sense that they prevent a wide scope of different types of support that could be provided to Russia and obviously shouldn't. And with that, I thank you for your attention and pass on to the next speaker. Thank you.
So, Matt Malone, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. I apologize at the outset. I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm too distrustful that it'll work, but I've never seen one not work during the conference, so I have some regrets about that, but just apologies. Thanks for the invitation. I have never been to SciComm before. All the panels that I've attended have been really interesting, great mixes of people in industry, military, government, academia. It's really exciting. My paper is about sanctions, but I'll come to it at the very end. So the discussion that I want to have and the paper that's in the conference proceedings is really about cross-border data flows and broaching the subject with a security lens, which is something that's not often done. So cross-border data flows are essentially information exchanges between servers that cross country borders. And it's indisputable that they are sources of significant wealth in the digital economy. One of the things that's interesting about this is that they sometimes receive comparative treatment to other types of commodities that are essential to our economy, like oil. But it's striking that we don't actually treat this commodity in a similar way when it comes to import and export restrictions. And that in itself was something that has always caught my attention, because it's clear that the prosperity of liberal democracies hinges on the security of this commodity. And disruptions to its supply chain could have a security impact. And so what I want to talk about today, and then what's broached in a little bit more detail in the paper, in the conference proceedings, is really this idea of how can we deploy cross-border data flows to talk about enhancing security objectives, for example, cooperative security, and how might restricting them serve to achieve security ends in a defensive or in a deterrence capacity. And what really started these thoughts for me was a declaration that came out, that was released last July by the European Data Protection Board regarding data transfers to Russia. So just maybe for the Europeans, this might be remedial, but I do think for anyone from North America, this may be helpful to understand. So the European Data Protection Board is the body that's responsible for compliance with the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which in essence creates rights for European citizens and residents by imposing obligations on data collectors and data processors when it comes to the collection, use, retention, disposal of those citizens and residents' data. So it creates all kinds of rights around access, around rectification, around deletion, and those types of things. The GDPR also contains a provision regarding transfers outside of the European Union, so outside of the regions where it applies. And that's those provisions start at Article 45. And in essence, what they do is they say that transfers to third-party countries are permissible when the protections for the data in those foreign jurisdictions will be adequate, well, they will mirror and offer a comparative level of protection to the protection they would have in Europe. And so these are called adequacy determinations. So in July of last year, July 12th, 2022, the European Data Protection Board issued a really interesting advisory. It's just 2 pages long, but it was quite bellicose. And it, in essence, stated that Russia no longer has an adequacy protection, or there's no adequacy determination for data transfers of Europeans' personal data to Russia. And the statement went on to cite things like Russia's expulsion from the Council of Europe, degradation of the rule of law, and it noted as well that an unnamed data protection authority in Europe was actually assessing the lawfulness of blanket transfers. And so the statement engaged in a little bit of saber rattling, and it said, blanket transfers to Russia are not permissible. They must be assessed on a case-by-case basis to make sure that the protection that the data will have in Russia, that any of this personal data will have in Russia, is comparable to the protection it would have in Europe. So the tone was really striking, but it was an advisory statement. This is not a statement that comes with a lot of binding enforcement impact. And this is not really surprising because in general, cross-border data flows they're in academia and in scholarship, they're really under-theorized. When it comes to regulation, they're not very well regulated. So there's a bunch of reasons for this. There are definitional challenges when we talk about the type of data that we're actually referring to when we talk about cross-border data transfers. GDPR, for example, only pertains to personal data, so data that is information that is identifiable to someone. But there's obviously other kinds of data that we might be interested in regulating when we make these broad references. There's also competing regulatory approaches that involve considerations around a host of different priorities in jurisdictions. So for example, I'm from Canada, and one of the things that's happening in Canada is out of an imperative of reconciliation with Indigenous populations, there's a really strong move towards data sovereignty for Indigenous populations. So these types of things. And then we're seeing regional trade agreements start to impose de facto dynamics of how cross-border data flows are being regulated, sort of between party states. And again, a good example involves Canada. It's the treaty that replaced NAFTA, the free trade agreement in North America between Mexico, the United States, and Canada. The new treaty has a really sweeping provision which prohibits any restrictions whatsoever on cross-border data flows of personal data in the context of commercial exchanges. And we're seeing a proliferation of regulations pertaining to cross-border data flows in other trade agreements. So the European Union-Japan agreement refers to them and promises commitment to assessment of the systems in place. And we're also seeing it with the EU-Mexico agreement recently did the same. So these are interesting moves, but again, there are questions around whether or not data transfers like this are in fact trade, whether they're byproducts of trade, whether they happen too quickly or involve too many figures to constitute trade that is susceptible to regulation. And then the biggest area where you see regulatory efforts is really in the area of privacy and data protection, and that involves the GDPR. So this is motivated by a lot of different things. I mean, it's motivated by resistance to big tech power. It's motivated by concerns about American surveillance practices, in particular following the Snowden revelations. But we've seen a really strong push channeled through the GDPR to regulate data transfers. And so for the last 2 decades, there have been frameworks in place negotiated between the US and Europe that set the groundwork for the European Commission to make determinations of adequacy. So in other words, these frameworks are negotiated and they allow the European Commission to say that the protections of personal data that's transferred out of Europe, European citizens or residents data transferred out of Europe to the United States will get comparable protection, therefore there's an adequacy determination. And so we've had frameworks for most of the last 2 decades. In 2000, there was one, Safe Harbor Principles, that was negotiated, and then a very enterprising Austrian law students can change the world, took a case to the Court of Justice of the European Union, and in 2015, the court invalidated the agreement, largely out of concerns about American surveillance practices. And it was an incredible change, and it essentially, through the invalidation of this framework, created a lot of uncertainty for businesses who rely on these transfers. This was immediately replaced by the Privacy Shield in 2015, and that was again and again by this enterprising law student from Austria, invalidated in 2020. So what's happening now is that these transfers kind of go back to a default, which is standard contractual clauses, so just the bare minimum of procedural guardrails that exist to govern whether or not these transfers are actually meeting the adequacy requirements in the GDPR. So it's really concerning for big corporate actors in particular who rely heavily on these types of transfers as part of their business model. And last year, President Biden, during his visit to Europe, made an announcement with some of his colleagues, his European colleagues, that they were that a new framework had been negotiated, but it hasn't come into force yet. And a few weeks ago, the European Commission even released a statement saying that they're trepidatious to do so because they think it's likely to be invalidated. And that's my view as well. I think the framework is too similar to the previous frameworks. And so it's almost certain that history is going to repeat itself, and I should stop referring to large business. I should just say any corporate actor engaging in transfers between the liberal democracies' 2 largest economic blocs, the United States and Europe, are subject to a lot of uncertainty. And sometimes the European data protection authorities are clamping down. So a few weeks ago, the Irish Data Protection Authority put a $1.3 billion fine on Meta for its failure to abide Article 45 and 46 regarding the transfers and the duties it had. So these disputes have not gotten as much attention as I think they deserve, but both parties, the Americans and the Europeans, are sort of right, in my view, in their respective concerns. The Europeans are right that the Americans show really no interest in passing a meaningful privacy or data protection law at the federal level. There are some jurisdictions within the United States, notably in California and Illinois, with its biometric law, that have some privacy protection, and then there's certain areas of subject matter pertaining to children or health information where the Americans have moved pretty rapidly, and early on, I should say. But for the most part, there's just no interest in it. Anyone who watched the Senate hearings regarding AI, there was almost an apologetic tone amongst a lot of the senators that Americans still haven't done that. So those critiques from the Americans, I think, are valid. But from the American perspective, I think their view is that they certainly do take protections for sensitive, economically valuable, and economically sensitive information very seriously. Really, my main area of research is in trade secrets and confidential information and economic espionage being part of that. And the Americans have moved really quickly in terms of codifying laws regarding the misappropriation of trade secrets. They've moved really fast and really quickly, and this is continuing across pretty much every administration. When it comes to the enforcement piece, so the investigation and the prosecution piece, whereas Europeans don't really show any interest in these types of things. The trade secrets directive that was passed by the European Union is not binding. It has a minimum standard threshold, but it's not a regulation, right? It's not equivalent to the General Data Protection Regulation, which is transposed onto the member states. It's just a directive. So there's a lot of problems with both of the approaches in terms of how the Americans see the Europeans operating and the Europeans see the Americans operating. And I would add that in my own view, and there's a lot of scholarship on this, but the GDPR itself is becoming a bit of an antiquated device. It's premised on a model of rights which is individual, which clearly doesn't work when a lot of the harms that we see from privacy and data breaches really comes in the form of a collective harm, right? And it doesn't create collective rights. It doesn't have that. It's premised on these illusions of notice and consent that don't really actually operate. I mean, we don't really consent to our data collection anymore. Consent is more of a duty nowadays. And finally, I think AI is also going to further erode privacy and make this instrument kind of meaningless. So, where are we overall with transfers between the liberal democracy's two largest economic blocs? Well, we don't have a framework. We've got a framework that's proposed that's likely not going to work, and it's likely not going to be implemented anytime soon. So what I talk about in my paper is why don't we look at cross-border data flows through a security lens? And why don't we think about where the liberal democratic world's two largest economic blocs have a forum where they share common security interests like NATO? And so a good chunk of the research that I've been doing and that I'm going to continue to do and try to synthesize into a report of some kind is doctrinal research showing, doctrinal legal research showing that NATO has the authority and the capacity to act here. It has the authority to, within its own treaty, to resolve disputes between members in order to fulfill its foundational provisions. And the GDPR itself has all kinds of language pertaining to derogations for security. So whenever there's a security interest at play, GDPR's efficacy, enforcement, implementation, it kind of goes out the window. You can look at recitals that make very clear there are derogations when it's a security issue. Article 2 states that explicitly that it does not apply, and even more importantly, there's no, the GDPR only applies to EU law, and the NATO, sort of this interaction between what is NATO law and what is EU law is a really interesting question that has not gotten a lot of attention. And I think in this context, it's actually worth really examining where those boundaries might be between the two of them. And so this is a good chunk of the paper and where I will continue to do some research and kind of produce a report on that. So just in conclusion, because I'm hitting my time, what am I suggesting, tachlis, in a nutshell, is this idea of NATO as a safe data zone. This has already come up in a few sort of interesting reports. There's one of the deputies in the White House office of, I forget what it's called, National Cyber Director, the Office of the National Cyber Director, before joining the office at the Council of Foreign Relations, published a really interesting report. His name's Kanaka, talking about the creation of safe data zones, but he did it exclusively from a trade and commerce perspective. And I think that's a really good starting point. It shows that there's an interest in this between state parties that have shared common security interests. So that's the idea. I do think that a move towards this type of model would present all kinds of opportunities when it comes to embargoing data flows as well. And that's where the contrast with the European Data Protection Board measure is really interesting to me, because their measure was high on rhetoric and had essentially no real meaningful impact. So it would be really interesting to actually have a body that could create and issue orders that actually result in embargoes of data transfers. And that would, I think, that could do a lot to sort of overcome, critiques of sanctions, which I think other folks are going to address today, that exist around, sanctions resistance or symbolic sanctions, symbolism over impact, and so forth. The other two pieces, the other three pieces I just mentioned really quickly, Europe and the United States have failed to come to an agreement here in terms of a framework, and they're about to fail again. And so there's an imperative, there's a space here to move. And I think the emergency that has resulted from the Russian invasion of Ukraine presents that as an opportunity to really think about NATO in a new perspective, to renew NATO's purpose in that respect, to turn it from maybe something that only a few years ago was the subject of, target and ire from the President of the United States saying that it might be worth leaving or dismantling, and turning it into something that it can be renewed. Yeah, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Matt. Perfect time management. So now, Alessandro, you have the floor.
Thank you, Professor. It's really a pleasure to be here in this very interesting conference. So with this presentation, the aim is to give you a general overview of what the EU restrictive measures against Russia are. But first, some general information on EU restrictive measures. Now, EU restrictive measures represent an important tool in the European Union Common Security and Foreign Policy. And of course, all our EU restrictive measures are adopted in line with Article 21 of the Treaty on the European Union. So all the actions of the European Union in the international scene are guided by the principle of democracy, rule of law, human rights. And in this framework, we are adopting these restrictive measures in general. I'm trying to avoid to use the term sanctions because we don't want to lead to any kind of misunderstanding. Our EU restrictive measures have the aim to bring to a change of policy in a specific country that we're targeting. And therefore, there is no punitive nature, but it has a preventive nature. So, of course, we are adopting these restrictive measures in relation to specific situation. But, of course, our restrictive measures have the aim to bring to a change of policy in all our sanctions regime. Our restrictive measures are proportionate in relation to the objective that we seek to obtain, to achieve. And at the same time, they are temporary measures. They are reversible. We can just decide to suspend our restrictive measure to interrupt the effects of our restrictive measures at any time. Our restrictive measures are applied within the EU territory or in general under the EU jurisdiction, so also applied by EU persons and entities. And our restrictive measures are fully compliant with international law and, of course, respecting human rights and fundamental freedoms. Which are the main phases of our restrictive measures? So the first phase is the adoption. So we have the adoption of our restrictive measures within the Council of the European Union. And after the adoption of our restrictive measures, there is a quite intense phase, which is the review phase. There is always a monitoring of our restrictive measures. So every 6 months, we collect, for example, observations which are submitted by persons or entities which are affected by these restrictive measures, or, for example, member states within the European Union which are providing, for example, feedbacks. For example, there is an issue in relation to this particular provision of the restrictive measures. So during this review phase, we take all these feedbacks into account in order to, in a certain way, ameliorate our restrictive measures. Then we have the implementation enforcement phase. Of course, this is under the responsibility of the member state, and the Commission of the European Union has an important role in a certain way, monitoring the implementation of the restrictive measures within the territory of the European Union. And there is this third phase, where the Council Legal Service is deeply involved, because we are the one responsible for defending our decision in adopting all these restrictive measures in front of the General Court in Luxembourg, because all the persons, entities which are affected by our restrictive measures have the right to bring an action in front of the court. So we have also this very important and I would say intense phase of litigation. Now, more specifically, in relation to the EU restrictive measures adopted against Russia, we have adopted so far 10 packages of restrictive measures. in response to Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, and at the same time also in response of the illegal annexation of Ukraine's Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions. As I said, our restrictive measures have a policy aim, and in this particular case, we are targeting the economic sectors of Russia in order to affect the capacities of Russia to continuing supporting and providing all the means to continue its war of aggression against Ukraine. We want to interrupt this possibility, we want to target these capacities, and therefore that's the reason why we are adopting this kind of restrictive measures. A very important difference that you have to keep in mind is that when we are referring to EU restrictive measures or packages of sanction against Russia, we have two different kinds of restrictive measures. We have the so-called sectoral restrictive measures, which have a different legal framework, and these measures are targeting in general specific sectors of the Russian economy. And then we have the so-called individual restrictive measures. Why we're calling them individual restrictive measures? What we're doing through this kind of restrictive measure is that we are including persons and entities. So these measures are specifically addressed to specific person and entities, and we are including this person under this kind of restrictive measures. I will explain a little bit more into details which is the difference between these two kinds of restrictive measures. Now, in general, which are the sectors that we are trying to target with this kind of sectoral restrictive measures? So, finance, transport, defense, energy, technology, and trade. More into details, as regard the financial sector, we were able to exclude from the financial messaging service, SWIFT, specific Russian banks. We have, in a certain way, included prohibitions, for example, regarding the transaction with Russian and Belarusian central banks, and with the Russian Regional Development Bank. Other kinds of restrictions, such as prohibition on public financing or investment in Russia. And of course, also the energy sector has been targeted. For example, we have established several prohibitions in relation to the imports from Russia of coal, import from Russia of oil, export to Russia of goods and technology in the oil refining sector. And of course, there are other restrictions related to this energy sector. Then we have, for example, restriction concerning raw materials and other goods. We have prohibition on export to Russia of luxury goods, prohibition on imports from Russia of iron, steel, wood, cement, and asphalt, and other kinds, of course, of raw materials, gold, including jewelry, seafood, spirits, cigarettes, everything. There are also prohibitions regarding services to Russia or addressed to Russian persons, prohibition to provide crypto asset wallet, IT consultancy services, technical assistance, brokering services, or financing or financial assistance. So we have several restrictions also in relation to this sector. As regard transport, we have closed the EU airspace to all Russian-owned and Russian-registered aircraft, closure of EU ports to all Russian vessels, and of course we have also other kind of prohibitions such as maritime transport of Russian oil to third countries, Russian and Belarusian road transport operators from entering the EU, and of course, export to Russia of goods and technology in aviation, maritime, and space industry is prohibited. And of course, we have also the specific sector of defense, where we have general prohibition on export to Russia of dual-use goods, technology items, drones, engines, armed and civilian firearms, ammunition, military vehicles, and paramilitary equipment. Of course, this is just a general overview of which are the restrictions which are affecting these 6 sectors of the Russian economy. Now, In relation to drones, since we were speaking of drones, just to underline that with the 9 package of restrictive measures, we have introduced restrictive measures, so a prohibition to export to Russia dual use and advanced technologies that might contribute to Russian military capabilities. And such as, for example, drones engines, as I said before, camouflage gear, additional chemical, biological equipment, riot control agents, additional electronic components which were found on the battlefield in Ukraine. And of course, we have also export restrictions concerning key industrial goods used by the Russian military, such as generators, toy drones, laptops, hard drives, IT components, cameras, lenses, and all this kind of equipment. Now, probably this is a very interesting aspect of our restrictive measures. As soon as the war of aggression against Ukraine started, we have faced an increase of propaganda activities coming from specific Russian media outlets. Now, of course, the European Union has tried to face this kind of actions, which we can say that are part of the military operation undertaken by the Russian military. And that's why we have introduced this broadcasting ban. So all these media outlets that you can see are under our broadcasting ban. All these media outlets, we have evidence showing that they are involved in disinformation activities, propaganda activities supporting the war. And of course, all these media outlets are controlled by the Kremlin. So taking all this information into account, the European Union have decided to include under the broadcasting ban all these media outlets in order to face these propaganda activities that is not only addressed it's not only undertaken in Russia, but also in the neighboring countries around Russia, and specifically also against the European Union. Now, as regard the individual restrictive measures, as I said, which are the effects? So when we are including a person or an entity under individual restrictive measures, there are 2 effects. The first one is all his assets are frozen. There is this asset freeze. And second point is that there is a travel ban. So this person is not allowed to enter inside the European Union. And of course, there is also a general prohibition that no funds or economic resources shall be made available directly or indirectly, or for the benefit of natural legal person, entities, or bodies which are included in the individual restrictive measures. So far, we have listed almost 1,500 persons and more than 200 entities. I would like to underline that, as I said, the review process is a process where we keep on receiving observation coming from all persons and entities. Sometimes the information which are provided, the observation are valid, and therefore sometimes the Council of the European Union decides to delist specific person from this kind of restrictive measures. Other times the observation are not convincing. Sometimes there are false informations which are provided by this person. So there is also a careful assessment on the information which are submitted to the Council. And therefore, there is really a huge amount of work behind the review process of this kind of individual restrictive measures. Now, going a little bit more into details. So, how are we able to list a person or an entity? First of all, what we have to have is an evidence pack. An evidence pack is necessary. It could include classified information, could also be open source information. Through this evidence pack, what is necessary is that we have to support one or more of the listing criteria that we have that are available, which are, for example, the listing criteria. These are all the listing criteria we have. They are very general. We have, for example, the listing criteria, natural person responsible for supporting or implementing actions or policy which undermine or threaten the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence of Ukraine. We have also some recent listing criteria that were introduced under these individual restrictive measures, such as leading business person or legal persons, entities, or bodies involved in economic sector providing a substantial source of revenue to the government of the Russian Federation. And the latest criterion which was introduced is the so-called circumvention criterion. Through this criterion, we are able to list natural legal person, entities, or bodies facilitating infringements of the prohibition against circumventions of the provision of this decision, so in relation to several restrictive measures. This is an example of a person which is listed under the individual restrictive measures, so you have different columns. So on the right side, you have the entry number. You have then name, surname, and the third column you will see identifying information, which are very important for the implementation phase. For example, when a person which is listed tries to enter inside the European Union, through this identifying information, we are able to implement our restrictive measures. And then you have the most important column, which is called the statement of reasons. This is very important because, as you can see, we explain which are the reasons under which we have decided to include this person or this entity under the individual restrictive measures. And at the very last part, the last sentence, you will see which is the listing criteria that has been chosen in order to list this person or this entity. This is very important because when we are facing court cases, the applicant relies on this statement of reason. It's basically claiming, for example, you don't have evidence which is supporting this kind of statement of reasons, or the statement of reason is wrong. So that's the part where actually the litigation takes place. Just for information.
Alessandro, sorry, but if you can maybe wrap up in 2 minutes.
Yes, sorry. Very quickly. So through our individual restrictive measures, we were also able to list companies and also persons involved in the supply of drones to Russia, which were used in the ongoing war of aggression. And most important point, what we are looking now is the aim is to minimize the risk of circumvention. We have already introduced some provisions in relation to circumvention. The first one is we're trying to avoid, for example, the export of dual-use goods, which is also transiting in the territory of Russia in order to reach a third country. So we are also aiming to face these kind of problems, and we have also introduced the circumvention criterion. These are just some information on the pending court cases we have, more than 60. We have also sectoral measures court cases, 12, 10 are still pending. Just to underline that we have really an incomparable number of court cases brought by all these listed persons. Thank you, sorry for the extended time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. And Ewelina, now is your turn. Please.
Thank you, Professor. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure for me to take part in this important conference. I will focus my speech on these main arguments. I will talk about Guardia Finanza, who we are, how we work, and our specific skills. I speak about the Financial Security Committee. It's the main authority in Italy that decides which assets have to be freezed. In the second part, I represent the investigative model of Guardia di Finanza and an operational case. This is a presentation of police and armed forces in Italy. So, Guardia di Finanza is a police force with a military order, which depends directly of the Minister of Economy and Finance, with administrative and judicial powers. According to Italian law, it has exclusive competences in terms of prevention and repression of violation of the rules set up to protect any financial interests of the country and, of course, of the European Union. The prime mission of Guardia di Finanza is to protect the legal economy. Sorry, I'll go back. Is to protect the legal economy and the state businesses. Its activities are connected with financial, economic, judiciary, and public safety. It fights against money laundering and criminal and financial crimes. It carries out customs and borders checks and conducts the anti-mafia operation. This last operation often in partnership with Carabinieri and the police. We operate with two main components, the operational departments and the special departments. The second one are located in Rome, and they conduct the most complex investigation, and there are some branches of these special departments. These departments are specialized units set up to investigate specific operation in various sectors or to correspond to central institutional authorities. You can see that their name suggests their specialty. And I highlighted one of them, the Special Currency Police Unit, which is the department that cooperates with the authority that decides which assets must be freezed. More in detail, this special unit ensures deep analysis on each suspicion transaction reports. And decides whether to send the suspicion transaction report to a territorial department for further investigation, or in some cases to carry out directly the operational investigation on the ground. An important fact is that only Guardia di Finanza and the FIU, Italian FIU, has the possibility to access to the database of this suspicion transaction report. So this is a very important database, and there we can see all the transactions of the persons and also of the family members. In this case of the listed person or the person who are proposed to be listed. As I said before, the Financial Security Committee is the authority that decides which assets have to be freezed. Regarding the European sanction system applied in Italy, since 2001, it is placed at the Ministry of Economy and Finance and is composed of 12 members. They are appointed by the Minister of Justice, Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Bank of Italy, Minister of the Interior, and 4 officers are also part of it. They are from Guardia di Finanza, Carabinieri, and 2 officers from the 2 anti-mafia and anti-terrorism directions. The committee has the power to gather information from different administration and to order to freeze assets. The committee asked Guardia Finanza to check the economic position of subject of interest. As I said before, the subject can be who are listed or some that we are examining and are proposed to be listed. The communication for the assets freezing is after the decision, of course, of this committee. The communication for the assets freezing is sent to Guardia Finanza that proceeds to notify the deed to the institutional offices that held the registers. For example, state conservatory, state property agencies, and the revenue agency. However, the special unit also checks directly the lists, and when it detects assets, it informs the committee about the situation and wait for the last decision. And a question: what about the credit institution? How the banks behave in this situation. So, according to Italian law, credit institutions are obliged to check the lists, and they have to block automatically the assets of the listed persons. And afterwards, they proceed to communicate this decision to the committee, to Guardia di Finanza, and to the FIU in Italy. So they don't need to ask to the committee. So when we have to investigate about a situation, we can have two different situation. Assets directly held by the person listed. So in this case, we use recent software that we can call backbone architecture. This project provides a single access point for the use of computer application, and it is able to check in the same time more than 200 databases. So at the end of this check, we have many information about one subject. In the second situation, of course, we have assets indirectly held by the person listed. In this case, we have to discover, to go beyond the form and depend the real owners of economic resources in Italy. In this case, the special unit involves also territorial departments, which can operate with many methods that permit to recover information. For example, anti-money laundering inspections. What it is? We control professionals such as accountants or notaries or also real estate intermediaries. In this case, we verify the purchase documents of luxury properties. For example, we check if the purchase was made by the listed person's wife. In that case, we check if the marriage is in community of property or in division. In case of community of property, we can proceed to freeze the asset. In case, unfortunately, of the division of property, we can't proceed to freeze the asset. Since 2017, 17, the Corps, the Guardia Finanza, has exclusive jurisdiction also over the surveillance at sea. Therefore, we do checks also on boats and monitoring vessels. So we can ask for crew list, passenger list, and for example, territorial department in Tuscany checked a vessel for the 3 times, and in these 3 times, the same listed person was on board. So they investigated, and they were able to discover that this person was the beneficial owner of this vessel. We also query the database, as I said before, of the suspicion transaction reports, and we proceed to anti-money laundering checks. It is possible to freeze the assets of family members? No. They also must be listed, or we can propose that they are listed. I want to say also another thing about the penal code in Italy. We have the crime of evading the seizure of assets, but also if we find only in case of organized crime, smuggling, money laundering, and self-laundering. So, unfortunately, the crime of evading the seizure of assets in this case, for these listed persons, nowadays it's purely an administrative violation. Maybe in the future it can be also a crime, but now it's only an administrative violation. This is shortly an operation case that permitted to discover the beneficial owner of the vessel that you can see, and these were the steps that the territorial department made to discover, and thanks to the bank transaction, we were able to discover the beneficial order, because this person paid the companies that have carried out maintenance and the renovation of the vessels. So, at the end, we have frozen assets for about 2 billion euros. But who bears the costs? Recently, some journalists in Italy said, oh, it's very expensive for Italy to maintain all these luxury goods of these big houses, vessels, and so on. So, in theory, the costs of freezings are covered by the Italian government, but most of the listed persons prefer to bear the cost themselves. 19% pay now for this cost. Why? Because the parties, these persons, these subjects, know that they have to refund in the future the Italian government. This is the first reason. But maybe the most important reason is because they can decide which can they do with the money, and how maintain the good. So you can understand that the Italian government can pay also for the cost that it's only basically cost, not for the maintenance long term. So they want to maintain these goods at the best, so they prefer to pay themselves. all of them, all of these listed persons, appealed to the court because they can make an appeal to the Administrative Regional Court of Lazio against the deep of freezing assets. Lazio is the region where the capital
Ewelina,
city...
I'm sorry, I will also ask you to wrap up in a couple of minutes. Okay?
Yeah. Lazio is the region where the capital city is located. So all of them have appealed to the court. Recently, last April, we have the first decision of this court about a trust, and now I don't have the time to explain. It's not the situation that I have to explain. If somebody wants a copy of this sentence, I can send it by email. But so the court decides that it agree with the committee and with Guardia Finanza, but for the last decision, it sent the sentence to the European Court of Justice for the last decision. So we are waiting for this sentence. And if the listed person is abroad, the seizure notification is made by the consulate or the embassy. So thank you so much for the attention, and if you have questions, thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we will open discussion, but probably I will misuse my position and pose the first question. First of all, it will be addressed to Alessandro, but other panelists, of course, are also welcome to answer. As it is known, the 11th package of restrictive measures will be entirely targeted to make the previous sanctions work. Because it's indeed very topical issue. First of all, we can see so-called transit. Then something goes, for example, from Estonia to Kazakhstan via Russia, but it's never arrive in Kazakhstan, everything remains in Russia. Another problem, some countries which are not participate in a sanction regime, like Turkey, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, their trade between them and Russia after the beginning of full-scale invasion raised sometimes not even 400, but 1,000%. So it's absolutely clear that they simply sell to Russia with sanctioned goods. Another problem is that Russia now even use, for example, microchips from household appliances like washing machine, fridges, they simply taken out and put it to the military equipment. So basically, such tricks, they destroy the entire regime actually. And because of that, could the request require the, first of all, prohibition of transit via Russia, second, imposition of the secondary sanctions as to the countries which continue to trade with Russia. Do you think it's realistic or?
Thank you, Professor, for this question. Actually, the 11th package, I mean, there was, of course, some information, but of course, it's still under the assessment by the Council. What I can say is that, as I said, one of our I would say, challenge is to minimize as much as possible the risk of circumvention. As I said in one of my first slides, our restrictive measures are applied within the territory of the European Union and under, in a certain way, the jurisdiction of the European Union. And of course, we must be sure that our restrictive measures do not have an extraterritorial effect, because, of course, there is an aspect that must be taken into account. We have our restrictive measures, we have our policy aim, and of course, we have to be very careful because, of course, third countries can have their commercial interest with Russia. They can export their products. The issue is when these products are coming from the EU. And that's where we are working. We're working in order to make sure that all these circumvention effects are avoided. And I want to underline that there must be a link with the European Union, because otherwise we could have the risk of having extraterritorial effects of our restrictive measures, which is not what we are willing to do. So and of course we have an eye on and that's why we are monitoring the implementation of the restrictive measures. We are aware that there have been, and we have realized that, for example, on the battlefield, we have found semiconductors, products which were coming from the EU. So we were wondering, okay, how these products are reaching the battlefield. And that's why, for example, we have introduced this circumvention criterion. That's why, for example, we are addressing the issue of the transit to Russia of our products, which are going to third countries. And of course, we are going to work much more on in order to avoid any kind of risk of circumvention. And yes, probably the 11th package will address this risk. And we will try to make as much as possible our restrictive measures effective. Thank you.
Thank you. Comments from other panelists? Then, please, I think, yes, please introduce yourself first and you can pose your question.
Hi, my name is Talita Diaz and I'm with Chatham House. I have a question for Alessandro, if that's okay. So I'm also a lawyer. And my area of expertise is international law, and I'm currently doing work on countermeasures. So your presentation is very relevant to my work. And so the first question that I have for you, I have a bunch of questions, but I'm just going to ask a couple. The first one is, you mentioned at the beginning in one of your slides that the restrictive measures are consistent with international law. They have the purpose, their purpose is not punitive, and they seek to induce compliance with EU law and international law. But I was wondering if all of these sanctions are taken as a matter of international law per se, or they're just consistent with international law but taken under EU law. So what's the legal basis of these sanctions? And then the second question is related to the purpose of those sanctions. So you mentioned, again, they're not punitive, they seek to induce compliance, but traditionally sanctions are meant to induce the state in breach to comply with the law itself, right? Rather than taking executive enforcement action. So that's the traditional view, but we have seen now an increase in sanctions of the kind, of the executive kind. So taking action, if you will, with your own hands, right? So, and hackbacks, for example. So I was wondering if these measures, as a general matter, they seek to induce Russia to stop the war, right? But individually, if we take these various restrictive actions, like restricting, for example, transfer of weapons, or transfer of drones, or transfer of goods, if seen individually, these different measures, they seek to take executive action, really, to stop, for example, violations of the laws of war, and so on and so forth. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that, and yeah.
Okay, very, very interesting questions. So, of course, our restrictive measures are taken in accordance with the articles of our treaties. In particular, for example, in relation to our restrictive measures, we always have a council decision, which is taken in accordance with Article 29 of the Treaty on the European Union and the regulation Article 215 of the TFEU. So, the first reply is, of course, our restrictive measures, the main legal basis is provided by EU law. Of course, the question is, which is the relation with international law, EU law and international law. Now, as far as I'm aware, we don't have a provision in international law which is against this kind of unilateral restrictive measures. And what we always look at is really to be in line and in accordance with international law. So what I can say is that our restrictive measures have the main legal basis, which is EU law, and EU law is in accordance with international law. Of course, you were referring to countermeasures. Probably we could identify our restrictive measures as sort of countermeasures in relation. So I don't think that we have any I would say, issue in relation to international law. I think that we are acting in accordance with the EU law, and EU law is in accordance with international law. Also in the treaty, there is a lot of importance which is given to international law. We are really taking into account international law in every provision of EU law. So that's for the first question. On the second question, there is not the nature. Our restrictive measures are not punitive. For example, when recently we have listed some persons which were involved in the violent repression, for example, in Belarus. I think it was August 2020, for example. And just for the fact that this person, for example, were involved, I'm referring to, for example, law enforcement officers, which were involved in cracking down all these peaceful protests, just for the fact that they were involved in this kind of repression, a posteriori, that was not sufficient to list them. We had to collect evidence that, for example, this kind of behavior was not in relation to a simple act, but is something that can be repeated, has been repeated, and it will be, so far, if they will still covering this kind of position, they will have an impact on for example, on Belarus, on the peaceful protest. So when I'm referring to this preventive nature is that we are not simply, for example, targeting a sector or a specific person in relation to a specific act, full stop. What we are assessing is really which is the influence, the contribution that this person or this company or this sector is still having in relation to, for example, our CFSP objective, which is really to stop the war and to really affect the capacities of Russia to wage its war. For example, just to let you know, we have listed what we call, according to the listing criteria, leading business person. Now, this leading business person are frequently leaving their positions in order to avoid being kept listed, because the listing criterion is leading business person involved in economic sector providing a substantial source of revenue. So when they are leaving their position, I'm not anymore the CEO of this important company, then which is the listing criterion upon which we can rely to keep him listed. Now there is an assessment during the review process where we see if this person is still relevant in the system, in the Russian system, if he's still able to contribute. If we see that his behavior, is, and this is very hard to assess, of course, but if it's something that takes into account really, for example, statement against the war, he's taking position against, for example, President Vladimir Putin, or this kinds of behavior, and we see that there is this change of behavior, then this could be an element that we take into account in order to delist the person. But this is in order to really make sure that our measures are not punitive. We really want to assure that there is a change of behavior, change of policy. In that sense, we think that our restrictive measures do not have a punitive nature, but a preventive nature.
Thank you. Because time is almost over, a very brief question to finalize discussion. Yes, please.
This is Camilla from the Ministry of Justice in Norway. I was just wondering about the individual measures. Do you find that they are somewhat based on random criterions and that the effects sometimes are random? Because I heard you said something about that you get information or tips about certain individuals. So do you have that risk of having a random system?
Okay. So, first of all, I think that the case law of the Court of Justice allows the European Union to have a wide discretion in aiming to have specific, for example, policy objectives. And our listing criteria are adopted. Of course, there is a very careful assessment in order to respect our policy objective. The fact that, for example, we're including under our restrictive measures leading business person, first of all, leading, we have to analyze very well which is the system which is characterizing Russia. Whoever is in a certain way in certain position has a close relation with the Kremlin. And of course, we have also to look at that objective aim, because we are listing those leading business persons, for example, of companies which are providing a substantial source of revenue. So there we have an objective aim, which, as I said, our CFSP objective is to stop the financing of the war. And I think that, for example, this listing criteria falls within this CFSP objective. On the evidence pack, of course, in order to consider an evidence pack sufficiently solid to support one of these listing criteria, there is a careful assessment. Now, we relied on information which are provided, for example, by the member state, from the European External Action Service. So all this evidence which is collected is related to that specific listing criteria. So I don't think that there is this large discretion in listing anyone, or this is very careful assessed, and of course it takes a lot of time, especially from the Council Legal Service point of view. That's our job. Our job is really to assess if we have legal grounds to proceed with the listing of a person or a company. And as regard, as I said, the listing criteria, I think that they all fall within our CFSP objective. I don't think that they are so wide that they are able to include anyone. No, I think that, of course, we are very careful in that. And I think that if you will look at our 1,500 persons, we have target-specific persons which have an important role and influence in Russia and in relation to the war. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting topics, but unfortunately our time is over. Before we will finish, we would like to present small souvenirs to our esteemed guests.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.